When I saw 35 luxury houses sitting on my grandfather's land, I didn't shout. I just smiled. Because those people forgot the dam upstream still carried my name. And when I opened those gates, I didn't just release water, I released 50 years of justice they never saw coming. When I finally came home, I expected silence, the kind that hums between cedar trees and the slow roll of creek water. My family's land had always been like that, quiet but alive. My grandfather built a small dam there half a century ago, a handmade wall of stone that tamed the stream and kept the valley green. He called it the heart of the valley. But when my truck rolled down the gravel road that morning, the heart was gone. In its place stood neat rows of pastel houses, trimmed hedges, and a polished sign that read Willow Ridge HOA, a community of excellence. My stomach dropped. The dam was dry, the creek diverted, and the land that carried my family's name was smothered beneath asphalt and cul-de-sacs. I parked where our barn once stood. The air smelled of wet paint and chlorine instead of soil and pine. Then she appeared, a woman in a coral blazer with a clipboard glued to her hand. "Can I help you?" she asked, lips pressed tight. "I own this land," I said. She gave a patronizing laugh. "You must be mistaken. This is HOA property now." Her name was Maggie Thornwell, president of the Willow Ridge Homeowners Association. She said it like she'd been elected queen. I didn't argue. I just looked past her toward the cracked hill where the dam once held the stream. She didn't know what she was standing on, or that the water beneath it still obeyed my name. One day soon, she'd learn exactly what that meant. I spent the next week digging through county records. What I found was worse than theft. It was deception dressed as paperwork. While I'd been overseas on contract, a developer named Crestwood Homes petitioned to rezone my grandfather's land. They claimed the old deed had expired, citing abandoned property. The local council approved it in record time. Maggie Thornwell's husband happened to sit on that same zoning board. They drained the dam, rerouted the creek for safety compliance, and parceled the land into residential lots. My grandfather's signature was still on the original water rights permit, a signature no one had the authority to cancel. When I confronted the county clerk, she just shrugged. "Developers have deep pockets, sir." The next day, I drove through the new subdivision. Maggie was hosting an HOA meeting on a folding table in someone's garage. She spotted me immediately, fake smile glued on. "You again," she said. "Still trespassing?" I held up a weathered folder, my grandfather's deed, the original blueprint of the dam, and the clause no one read. Federal water control rights remain with the Henderson estate in perpetuity. Maggie's smile faltered for half a second. Then she laughed. "Old paper won't save you. Progress already did its work." She turned her back and walked away. That night I sat by the dried dam, tracing the cracked earth with my boot. In the moonlight, the blueprint glimmered, lines and valves leading straight to the floodgates buried under silt. They'd stolen my land, but they'd forgotten the one thing that couldn't be rezoned, the water. And water, like truth, always finds its way back. I tried the polite route first, hired lawyers, sent letters, filed claims. Each one died in red tape. Every attorney warned me, "You're fighting money and politics, not fairness." Then the HOA began its campaign, anonymous complaints to code enforcement, citations for parking near the subdivision, a letter accusing me of tampering with community property. They wanted me gone. The stress nearly broke me, until one evening I opened an old chest from my grandfather's attic. Inside lay a rusted metal tube sealed with wax. Inside that, yellowed papers bearing the seal of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. My family hadn't just built a dam, they'd registered it as a federal flood control structure. That meant federal oversight, not county. And according to those documents, the registered operator of that dam was still James Henderson and successors. That successor was me. The next day, I called the Corps' regional office. The clerk confirmed it. The dam was still on record, dormant but active. I, legally, had authority to manage it. When I hung up, the frustration inside me hardened into focus. Maggie had used local power to bury me. I was about to use federal power to drown her empire. Metaphorically, of course. That night I stood on the ridge overlooking Willow Ridge. 35 houses glowed under streetlights, perfect little boxes of arrogance. The moment I read that clause, I whispered, I stopped being their victim. I became the flood. I spent weeks preparing. I mapped every drain, culvert, and stormwater channel feeding into Willow Ridge. I flew drones over rooftops, documenting how the builders had ignored floodplain boundaries. I took soil samples showing they'd built on soft clay, a sponge waiting for water. Then I gathered allies, farmers whose wells had run dry when the creek was diverted, an environmental reporter hungry for corruption, and an old surveyor who still remembered my grandfather's work. Together we built a file thick enough to sink a yacht. Inside were blueprints, dated photos, and proof of unpermitted drainage manipulation. I submitted copies to state water authorities and quietly alerted the Corps that I intended to perform a controlled maintenance release under the existing permit. It was perfectly legal. The forecast predicted heavy rain within days. To the HOA, it was bad luck. To me, perfect timing. On the night before the storm, I stood on the cracked dam wall with a flashlight. The old valves groaned but moved. I greased the hinges, cleared debris, and checked the emergency overflow. It was ready, safer now than the day it was built. Back home, I printed one last letter. It was addressed to Willow Ridge Homeowners Association, notice of upcoming maintenance per Section 7 of the Federal Water Control Charter. I slid it into their mailbox at dawn. By afternoon, Maggie was at my gate, waving the letter like it was a death sentence. "You can't touch that dam," she screamed. "Oh, but I can," I said calmly. "And I will." That night, thunder rolled across the valley. Lightning flashed above the ridge, illuminating the dry basin below. I felt the air shift, heavy, electric, waiting. The plan was in motion. And Maggie had no idea the storm wasn't her enemy. I was. The storm hit like vengeance. Sheets of rain hammered rooftops. The dry creek became a roaring vein of silver. I drove to the dam before sunrise, headlights cutting through fog. Halfway there, flashing lights appeared behind me, the sheriff's cruiser summoned by Maggie. He rolled down his window. "Ma'am says you're threatening to flood the neighborhood." I handed him the folder. Permits, maps, federal seals. "I'm operating under lawful maintenance. You might want to stand clear." He skimmed the documents, nodded slowly, and parked out of the way. Down below, Maggie and several HOA board members stood in raincoats, shouting orders. They'd set up sandbags near the model homes, clueless about hydrology. At precisely 7 a.m., I unlocked the main valve wheel. The old gears screeched, rust flaking away as the gate shifted. A deep rumble echoed through the valley, not destruction, but release. Water surged forward, filling the original creek bed, carving its rightful path. It wasn't a flash flood. It was measured, controlled, a slow reclaiming of what was stolen. Maggie screamed over the rain, "You'll pay for this!" I looked down at her soaked blazer and said quietly, "So will you." Neighbors filmed from porches as water coursed through the subdivision, pooling on driveways, soaking lawns, seeping into unfinished basements. The soil they'd built on simply remembered what it used to be: a river. Local news arrived within the hour. By noon, drones captured images of flooded luxury homes while I stood by the dam with the sheriff and the Corps' representative, who confirmed the release was authorized and safe. When the reporters asked for comment, I said one line, "I didn't break the law. I enforced it." Maggie's face went pale as federal inspectors arrived, measuring depths, snapping photos, noting violations. Her empire of manicured perfection wilted under muddy water. The rain eased by evening. From the ridge, the valley glistened, not ruined, but cleansed. By the next morning, the story had exploded online. HOA builds on wrong land. Owner opens historic dam, wins. Federal investigators confirmed everything. The HOA had built without proper environmental review. Crestwood homes collapsed under lawsuits. Maggie resigned in disgrace, later charged with falsifying zoning forms. Neighbors who once ignored me began to stop by, shaking my hand. Some offered help cleaning debris. Others just said, "About time someone stood up to them." The Corps issued a statement praising the controlled release for preventing larger flood damage. The county, desperate to save face, re-recorded the original property boundaries in my name. My grandfather's dam officially became a heritage site. When I walked the land again, the creek sang through its old bed. Fish returned. Willow trees bent over water that hadn't flowed there in decades. One evening I passed Maggie's old house, now empty, the "for sale" sign half submerged in mud. I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. I stopped by the ridge at sunset, watching the reservoir settle into its natural rhythm. Justice doesn't always roar, sometimes it just flows where it was meant to. "They built their empire on stolen ground," I said softly, "and water always finds its way home." Months later, grass had begun to grow where concrete once baked in the sun. The dam stood strong again, restored and humming quietly under the flow. I placed a new brass plaque beside my grandfather's old one. For those who forget where they build, the river will remind them. The town now calls the area Henderson Reserve. Kids fish where driveways used to be. The HOA is gone. The land alive. Sometimes neighbors stop to ask if I regret opening the gates. I tell them no. Because it was never revenge, it was correction. The land simply reclaimed its truth. If there's one thing I've learned, it's this. You can pave over history, but you can't silence it. Sooner or later, the past seeps through the cracks, and when it does, it washes everything false away. And as I stand on the ridge at dusk, listening to the steady rush below, I think of my grandfather's words. Water remembers. He was right.